Welcome to Libyth. Today we are in Heian, Japan, and today we have to perform the same small act of demolition we performed last episode. Because the question this episode promises to answer, on the surface, is not actually the question we are going to answer underneath. If you came expecting characters, in the sense you would mean that word for almost any other book, people with names and arcs and interior development you can track from one chapter to the next, you are going to come away disappointed again, the same way you would have come away disappointed looking for a plot. There are no characters in the Kokinshu in that sense. Nobody walks through scenes. Nobody changes across the course of the collection in any way you could trace cause and effect through. What there is instead, and what turns out to be just as rich a subject as character ever could be, is something closer to a small constellation of recurring voices and recurring images, figures and symbols that return again and again across 1,100 poems with enough consistency, enough accumulated weight, that they start to function with something close to the emotional gravity a character would carry in a different kind of text. So today, we are going to meet them. Not characters. Presences. Let's start with the single most consequential structural decision buried inside this entire question. A decision made not by accident but quite deliberately, by Tsurayuki himself. Inside the Kana preface, we have already mentioned several times across this series, and are going to keep returning to until we finally sit with it properly in a later episode. Tsurayuki, writing that preface, names 6 poets specifically as the great masters of the tradition, a group that later commentary would come to call the Rakeisen, the 6 Poetic Sages. Archbishop Henjo, Ariwara no Narihira, Funya no Yasuhide, the monk Kaisen, Ono no Komachi, Atomo no Kuronisi. 6 names, singled out by name, in the single most authoritative document the entire anthology contains, as the figures who define what excellence in this tradition actually looks like. Stop and notice what an extraordinary act this is, because it is easy to read past it as simple literary appreciation, a critic naming some poets he admires, when it is actually something closer to an act of institutional power. Before this moment, Japanese poetry had no formal canon, no official list of who counted as a master, no centralized critical apparatus deciding whose work would be remembered as foundational and whose would simply be allowed to fade. Tsurayuki, a mid-ranking courtier, not the most powerful man in the court, not a member of the great regent-producing aristocratic houses we spent an entire episode discussing, sits down and, in the single document the imperial court is putting its name behind, simply decides. He names the masters. He invents, in this one gesture, something the tradition had never formally possessed before, a Hall of Fame. And because this decision is embedded inside an officially commissioned, emperor-sanctioned text, it does not function as one critic's opinion among many competing opinions. It functions, almost immediately, as something closer to settled fact, an authoritative ranking that later generations would inherit and repeat rather than independently rederive. This is worth connecting directly back to everything we discussed about the structural hollowing of imperial authority happening at exactly this historical moment. A court losing its grip on taxation, on provincial administration, on the substantive machinery of governing, is at the very same time fully and completely in control of this, who gets remembered as great. Naming a canon costs nothing in soldiers or revenue, and yet it is one of the most durable forms of power a cultural institution can exercise, because canons, once established, tend to persist for centuries, quietly shaping what gets read, taught, and imitated long after the political conditions that produced them have completely disappeared. So let's actually meet these 6 names, or at least the ones whose afterlife turns out to be most revealing, because not all 6 sages carry equal weight in how later generations would remember and reshape them. Begin with Ono no Komachi, because she is, among this group, the figure most thoroughly transformed by the centuries that followed her own lifetime. And the transformation tells you something important about how literary legend actually works. Komachi was a real woman poet, contributing genuinely to the Kokinshū's love poetry in particular. Her surviving verses carrying exactly the quality we discussed back in our reading episode. Longing expressed through compressed natural imagery rather than direct statement. Grief and desire folded into a single small physical detail rather than announced outright. But across the centuries following the Kokinshū's compilation, Komachi's biography itself became almost entirely swallowed by legend. She became, in later tradition, the archetype of tragic beauty, a woman famed for extraordinary physical beauty in her youth who, according to legends with only the thinnest connection to anything we can verify about her actual life, was said to have ended her days in poverty and obscurity, her beauty and the admiration it once commanded having entirely evaporated. A real poet, contributing real poems to a real anthology, becomes over time something closer to a symbol, a fixed cultural shorthand for the specific tragedy of beauty's impermanence, a human figure increasingly absorbed into exactly the thematic obsession, transience, the fading of what once seemed permanent, that the anthology itself is organized around. Komachi becomes, in other words, almost a living embodiment of the Kokinshū's own central preoccupation, which makes her function inside later cultural memory less like a historical individual and more like one of the anthology's own recurring natural images, the cherry blossom that must fall, given a human face and a human name. Now turn to Ariwara no Narihira, because his afterlife follows a closely related but distinct pattern, equally revealing in its own way. Narihira contributed genuinely to the Kokinshū, real poems under his own name, much of it in the register of passionate, often illicit romantic longing. With his actual poems woven directly into the narrative, as though they were the spontaneous compositions of this fictionalized hero, in the midst of his romantic episodes. Watch what happens here, because it is structurally distinct from what happened with Komachi. Narihira does not simply become a symbol. He becomes the seed of an entirely separate fictional narrative, a real historical poet whose actual verses get extracted from their original anthology context and redeployed as dialogue inside an invented romantic plot loosely based on, but substantially embellished beyond, anything we can verify about his actual life. This is a genuinely remarkable transformation to trace, because it shows you something the Kokinshū itself, by its very structure, makes almost impossible. It shows you a story with an actual protagonist, actual romantic episodes, actual narrative causation, built directly out of poems that, inside their original anthology, carried no narrative context whatsoever. The poems did not change. Only their frame did. And once given a narrative frame, the same compressed, image-driven verses we discussed in our reading episode suddenly start functioning as something closer to character dialogue, evidence of an interior life belonging to a specific, named romantic hero, rather than as the free-floating, voice-without-plot expressions they were originally compiled as. This matters for our purposes today because it tells you something important about why the Kokinshū's poets feel, even without any narrative apparatus, oddly close to characters in the first place. They are not characters inside the anthology itself, but they are clearly characters waiting to happen, raw material sufficiently vivid, sufficiently emotionally coherent across multiple poems by the same hand, that later generations could not resist building narrative frames around them once the cultural appetite for narrative, rather than pure lyric, began to assert itself more strongly in the centuries following the anthology's compilation. And then there is Tsurayuki himself, who deserves to be discussed here not simply as the man who named the other sages, but as a figure occupying an unusually layered position inside his own anthology, a position worth calling out explicitly because it is genuinely rare. Tsurayuki is, simultaneously, one of the 4 official compilers responsible for selecting and arranging every poem in the collection, a major contributor whose own poetry appears repeatedly throughout the anthology in multiple categories, and the author of the Kana preface, the single document that establishes the entire critical and theoretical framework through which the whole collection is meant to be understood, including the framework that decides who the 6 sages even are. Compiler, contributor, and critic, all at once, inside the same official text. This is the editor, who is also one of the writers being edited, and also the theorist explaining what writing well even means in the first place. There is something almost architecturally strange about that triple role, because it means Tsurayuki is, in a very real sense, shaping how we read everyone else in the collection, including himself, simultaneously deciding which of his own poems made the cut and explaining, in the preface, the critical standards by which those very poems should be judged excellent. And his strangeness does not stop there, because outside the Kokinshū entirely, in a separate work called the Tosa Nikki, the Tosa Diary, an account of a journey back to the capital following a period of provincial duty, Tsurayuki does something genuinely odd. He writes the entire diary in a female narrative voice, adopting the persona of a woman recounting the journey, despite being, by every account, a man holding an official court position. Connect this back to something we mentioned all the way back in our first episode together, the detail about the Kana preface itself being written in the vernacular script associated, in this period, with women's private and emotional writing, rather than the prestige Chinese script associated with formal, masculine officialdom. Tsurayuki, across 2 separate works, seems to be doing the same underlying maneuver twice, reaching for the vernacular, emotionally coded register, the register coded as feminine in his own culture's own internal logic, specifically when he wants to achieve something the masculine, prestige Chinese language register apparently could not achieve as effectively, namely a particular kind of interior, emotionally direct expression. This is not a small biographical curiosity sitting outside our main subject. It is directly relevant to how we should understand Tsurayuki's role inside the Kokinshū itself, because it suggests a writer who understood, with unusual clarity for his era, that different registers of language carried different emotional permissions, and who was willing to move strategically between those registers depending on what kind of expression he was actually trying to achieve. We are going to come back to this entire question of script and gender properly in our next episode, when we sit with the Kana preface as a philosophical document in its own right. For now, simply hold on to Tsurayuki as our most layered figure, compiler, poet, critic, and a writer willing to borrow a different voice entirely when his own official, masculine voice was not the right instrument for the job. Now let's turn away from the human poets entirely and toward the other category of recurring presence running through this collection, the natural images that return again and again with enough consistency that they begin functioning almost like characters in their own right, even though they are not human at all. The cherry blossom is the most obvious of these, appearing across the spring books over and over, always carrying the same essential charge. Extraordinary beauty paired inseparably with extraordinary brevity. Beauty that is moving precisely because it cannot last. That derives its emotional power from the certainty of its own imminent disappearance. The autumn leaves and the turning maple carry a closely related but distinct charge, beauty intensifying at the exact moment of decline. Color reaching its most saturated, most striking point right before the leaf falls, and the color is lost entirely. A different angle on the same underlying preoccupation, with transients that the cherry blossom represents from the opposite direction. The Yuguisu, the warbler whose call we encountered back in our reading episode, functions as a kind of herald, the small creature whose presence announces a seasonal threshold before that threshold becomes visually obvious anywhere else. A tiny signal of change arriving ahead of change itself. And tears, appearing constantly across both the love poems and the laments, function almost as a connective tissue running underneath multiple categories at once. The single most reliable physical sign that grief and longing leave behind on the body, deployed again and again as the concrete, visible evidence of an interior state the poem otherwise refuses to name directly. What ties all of these recurring images together, human and natural alike, is something we touched on in our reading episode and need to state more explicitly here, because it is the real payoff of today's discussion. None of the major interior states in this collection, longing, grief, joy, fear, anger, tend to get named directly. They get spoken through an image instead. A blossom carries beauty's fragility, so the poet does not have to state that fragility as an abstract claim. A reddening sleeve carries grief's intensity, so the poet does not have to announce sadness as a flat statement of fact. A bird's call carries the threshold of seasonal change, so the poet does not have to describe that threshold in plain expository language. This is the actual emotional vocabulary of the entire anthology, and once you see it operating consistently across both the human poets and the recurring natural images, you start to understand why this collection, with no plot and no characters in the conventional sense, nonetheless manages to feel emotionally inhabited rather than abstract or cold. It has built its own internal cast, not of people moving through events, but of images and voices that recur with enough consistency, enough accumulated emotional weight across repeated appearances, that they end up doing almost exactly what characters do in other kinds of writing, giving you something specific, something recognizable, something you can recognize returning to hang your own feeling on. That's all for today on Libyth. One new book every week. At least we try.